Well, today's topic is something I don't know very much about, and I'm looking forward to learning about it. And our speaker is Professor Tetsuya Toyoda, and he's Professor of International Law and Director of the Institute for Asian Studies and Regional Collaboration at Akita International University, one of Japan's most international universities, where almost all the teaching is in English, as I understand it. And he himself is very international and has spent periods of time, well, he was actually at the Japanese Ministry of Foreign Affairs for a while, but he spent time in Washington, in the UK, more recently at the University of Buckingham, in Russia, in Australia, and you also studied in France, so he's been all over the place. And I've got a very long CV for him here, but I won't detain you any further, so over to you, Professor Toyoda.
Okay, good. Well, thank you very much, Mr. James Jason, for very kind introduction, and thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to talk about this very interesting issue. And I should thank most of all those who have come here to spend some time to think about this issue with me. So today's topic is British management of territorial disputes and the lessons for the Japanese government, talk at the Anglo-Japanese Foundation today. So I'm the professor of international law at Akita International University, and also I'm a former Margaret Thatcher Japan Foundation visiting fellow at the University of Buckingham. So I should also add my expression of gratitude to the Margaret Thatcher Japan Foundation, who has helped me spending time at the University of Buckingham. So I'd like to follow this outline to talk about the British management of territorial disputes and lessons for the Japanese government, and perhaps also the Japanese people. So first I'd like to why this topic is worth discussing, and then, well, many of you perhaps are versed in the three territorial disputes Japan has with its neighbors, but I should go over them nonetheless. And then we will see the British practice of judicial settlement in the past, and the British defeat in the Chagos Island case very recently, just last year. And then we will think about a little bit about politics of international law and the ICJ. ICJ stands for the International Court of Justice. And finally, what kind of conclusion is my ideas about lessons to be taken from the British experience for the Japanese government, and of course also for Japanese people. Here. Then, why this topic is worth discussing? First, this topic, well, it goes without saying that very important for Japanese diplomacy. But for every country, it is very important to be friendly with its neighbors. If the UK continues to fight against the French forever, like they did centuries ago, the UK could have never built an empire. It is only after you could make friends with your neighbors, then you can expand to the out of the region. But Japan could have never done that. Japan is still struggling to make peace with its neighbors, Russia, South Korea. North Korea is a very difficult case, so you can't blame the Japanese government. But even with China and even with Taiwan, Japan continues to have some historical issues. So for Japanese diplomacy, the question of course, there are many other issues of controversy between Japan and its neighbors, but the territorial issues are some of the most important ones. So the second point is the after effects of an empire. So what I think is that, well, so Japan has three major territorial disputes. One is with China, and the second with Korea, and the third with Russia. And the territorial dispute with Russia is a little complicated, but the dispute with Korea and China are the kind of after effects of Japanese successful imperial expansion. Well, very modest success compared to the great success of the British Empire, but still, the Japanese territorial disputes can be characterized as the side effects or the after effects of its imperial expansion in the past. So, to deal with those problems, perhaps we can learn from the great empire, that's the British Empire. Then, well, perhaps more important for me, because I'm a scholar of history of international law, historiography of international law, and I'm teaching international law at my university. The Chagos case. So Chagos case, well, that was the case on which the International Court of Justice rendered its advisory opinion, the kind of judgment, just last year, February last year. So that's very new issue. So with the issue of Chagos Island, we can see the latest development of international law of territorial disputes, which has a very important effects on the Japanese territorial issues. We will come back to the issue of the Chagos Islands case later in my presentation. But anyway, before I go further, I should emphasize, well, just a kind of a little political caveat. Every territorial dispute is very different. So every territorial dispute is unique, and the general theory can be nothing but an oversimplification. So if I compare some territorial disputes wrongly, don't blame me. I'm just trying to do some brainstorming. So please forgive me any errors in details I make about the territorial disputes of Japan and the United Kingdom. Okay, so that's the kind of introduction. Then let's see the three Japanese territorial disputes. So if you can name all of these three, you are an expert. The first one is the Senkaku Diaoyu-tai. The second one is Dr. Takeshima, and the third one, Southern Kuriles Islands and Northern Territory. And we also have, historically, we used to have two disputes with the United Kingdom in the past, which are not very known, but well, I will touch on them just a little bit. So let's see, I should show you where the Senkaku Islands. So that's the Senkaku Island. Oh no, and that's not the Senkaku Island. It must be enlarged. We are coming closer. So East China Sea. This is the Ishigaki Island, Miyakojima Island. This is Taiwan. Not yet. Yeah, there we have Senkaku Islands, the Diaoyu Islands, Diaoyu-tai. So that's the Diaoyu Islands. And these issues have been very important, especially in 2012. We had a huge, mass demonstration in China. So Diaoyu Dao, the Zhongguo Dao. I'm sorry for my poor Chinese, but people were very upset about the, Japanese government is still holding those Chinese islands. Those islands should be returned to China immediately, without delay, from the Chinese viewpoint. So this is the Japanese embassy in Beijing, and the people were gathering before the embassy. And I guess, Bao Wo Zhonghua, Hai Wo Diao or something like that. That's yes. Well, we should fight against the Japanese devils. This is 2012, already 8 years ago. And some vandalism, and Japanese shops were destroyed by the Chinese riots, and like this. So the Senkaku Island issue, Diaoyu Island issue, used to be very serious issue, perhaps still very important, but very, upsetting issue 80 years ago. And then we have the, yes, Dr. Takeshima. By the way, why I'm saying Senkaku Yuta and Dr. Takeshima. So I'm a Japanese, I should say Takeshima Doctor. My principle is that the Senkaku Yuta should be presented like that because actually the Japanese are holding the islands for the moment. So that's the reason why Senka comes first. But for Doctor is a Korean name for Takeshima. So it is the Koreans who are actually controlling the island. So Dr. Takeshima. The Dr. Takeshima issue is also very important. And where is Dr. Takeshima? So that's Japan. This is Ullundo. And this is okay. Still, yeah, now you can guess. From the Ullundo Island, you have a blue line leading to Dokdo. Yes. In the English version of Google Maps, they have chosen to call it Liankot Rocks to avoid avoid embarrassing the Japanese. And the Dokdo issue is of course very important. So, well, down the Japan down, and then we should fight against the Japanese invasion in Dokdo, so forth. Then finally, the Southern Kuriles, Northern Territory. That's here. You can guess. Yes. So this line of islands are the Kuril Islands. Kuril Islands from Kamchatka down to Hokkaido. And the largest island in the Kuril Islands is Itrup Islands. And the second largest, Kunashi. And these are the two main islands claimed by the Japanese. And according to the Japanese, these two islands do not belong to the Kuril Islands. They are Northern Territory. Don't call them Southern Kuril Islands. And then, yes, here, so they are the Japanese. The Japanese shouting against. Every year, February 17th is the Japanese day for Northern Territory. So at school, so in Korea, Korean students are taught at school to fight against the Japanese colonialism every year. And in Japan, well, nowadays less and less, but when I was a child at school, every year in February we are given some information sheet to learn about the Northern Territory, and we are taught to hate the Russians. So that's the Northern Territory. So coming back to the main line present. Here we go. Then. Two disputes with the UK in the past. I should have also talked about it. So, do you know the territorial dispute the UK had with Japan? No? It's here. Not yet? Not yet? Here. That's the Ogasawara Islands, which used to be called the Bonin Islands. And the Ogasawara Islands were first discovered by the Japanese in the 17th century, but the first inhabitants, first residents of the Ogasawara Islands were Americans and British. And the British government was one of the first governments who declared its sovereignty over the islands, Ogasawara Islands, in 1830 or sometime around 1830. And the Japanese government came to the Ogasawara Islands in 1860s, and they were surprised to see the Europeans living on the islands. And they hurried to declare, well, this is Japanese, so Europeans should go back and so forth. So from the viewpoint of international objective or scientifically speaking, the Bonin Islands could have become British. But in those days, in the 19th century, the British government were tired of acquiring territories overseas. Especially Treasury was against any acquisition of territories overseas. So perhaps there are some British and Americans living on those islands, but they are such remote islands. Why do we care for acquiring such tiny islands off the, was somewhere so remote. So the British government did not really try to acquire to obtain those islands, and also the Americans were putting pressures on the British government. So it was in in the 19th century, so only 100 years after independence. So the American government, well, no more British in the Pacific, so no more new British territory. So well, with these circumstances, the Japanese government was very lucky that even though they did not actually control the Ogasawara Islands, the Americans, and both the Americans and the British gave up their claim to the islands, and the Ogasawara Islands became Japanese. By the way, the Europeans who lived on those islands were given Japanese nationality. And we still have the descendants of the first residents of the Ogasawara Islands, one of whom is famous Mr. Sebori. That's the American name, Shibore, became Sebori in Japanese. I don't know if the descendants of Shibore family still speaks English, but anyway, they are the descendants of the Europeans on those islands. And the other territorial dispute the UK had with Japan is more recent. That's in the 1930s. 1930s, just after the Manchuria incident. The British government had a territorial dispute with Japan. Well, not directly. It was a little complicated dispute, but it was in this area. That's the famous Spratly Islands. The Spratly Islands in the South China Sea today are claimed occupied by the Chinese and the islands, Vietnamese, Malaysians, and many and Vietnamese are scrambling for the islands in the South China Sea. But before the Second World War, it was the dispute. There was a dispute between the French and the British on the one hand, and the French and the Japanese, the Chinese on the other. And the British government was the first European to have visited those islands, and the British government had a stronger case to claim the territorial sovereignty over the Spratly Islands. But again, Treasury was against acquiring new islands, and there was an internal dispute in the British government between Navy and Treasury, or Navy and Air Force on the one hand, and the Treasury and the Foreign Office on the other. And the Foreign Office and the Treasury were determined not to get these islands. These islands should be given to the French. And not directly between the British and the Japanese, but there were disputes between the French and the Japanese. So these are the territorial dispute Japan had today and Japan had with the British in the past. So now, Japan still has three very difficult territorial disputes, and what can the Japanese government learn from the British experience? British experience is brilliant until the Second World War. Perhaps until the 1960s, 1970s. And the British experience becomes less brilliant recently. So first, let's start with the brilliant experience. Until the Second World War, the British government has managed its territorial disputes very well. Very, very well. Well, consider that the British Empire in the early 20th century occupied more than 20% of the entire land surface around the globe. So it was quite natural for the British government to have many, many territorial disputes. But the British government did not waste its energy, political and diplomatic energy, on those disputes. The British government was very eager to settle all disputes through arbitration or judicial procedures. So before the Second World War, the British settled 7 cases with the US through the international judicial procedure. well, which was used to be called arbitration. And the 4 cases with Portugal and 2 cases with Germany, 1 case each with France, the Transvaal Republic, Venezuela, and Brazil. And the British government has had 11, 13, 14, 15, 16 cases. 16 cases settled by slow judicial procedure before the Second World War. That's by far the largest number of judicial settlement of territorial disputes. I mean, and then, for example, the U.S. has had, I think, 5 cases. I mean, 9 cases in total, but out of 9 cases in total, 7 were with the British. The British and the Americans had territorial dispute over the Canadian border, because Canada used to be part of British. So there was a famous St. Croix River case in 1798, and the Passamaquoddy Bay case, 1817, Great Lakes case, 1822, Sugar Island case, 1826, Northeastern Border case, 1831, San Juan case, 1872, Alaska Boundary case, 1903. So all these disputes were settled through judicial proceedings. And then 4 cases with Portugal, and most of them in the late 19th century. And the British Empire was much stronger, of course, than the Portuguese Empire. And if it really wanted, the British Empire, British Navy, especially British Navy, could easily overwhelm the Portuguese Navy in Africa, but the British government didn't do so. Treasury always wanted to keep the spending the strict minimum, and to do so, the judicial proceedings was actively made use of. And then that tradition carried on to the 1950s. And after the Second World War, we had the famous case of Minkier-Eclair's case between the UK and France, that's in the English Channel. And then in the same area, we had the Continental Shelf case, which was settled through arbitration again. So the British government, until the 1970s, never wasted their diplomatic and political energy on territorial dispute or maritime boundary dispute. So after the Second World War, the British government limited its overseas territories to the strict minimum. So the Chagos Islands in the Indian Ocean, and Falkland Islands, and Cyprus, Gibraltar, and Foyle and Carlingford. Foyle and Carlingford are the small, estuaries, bays between Northern Ireland and Southern Ireland. So the British government was very successful in judicial proceedings until the Second World War, but last year we had a catastrophic defeat in the Chagos Island case. Well, I hate to put so many letters on the slide, but these quotes are so important, so please forgive me putting so many letters on one slide. So just a quick history of the Chagos Islands. The Chagos Islands is in the midst of the Indian Ocean. It is a little close to the Maldives, but even from Maldives, it's 200 kilometers away. 200 kilometers away. And from Mauritius is close to Madagascar. I'm sorry, I should show you the map. Again, the map. Yes, Chagos Islands. So, Maldives here, and British Indian Ocean Territory. That's the British name for the Chagos Islands. And Mauritius is far away. I'm sorry, they are so small. Okay, here Sri Lanka, Maldives, the Chagos Islands, and Mauritius. So Mauritius is next to the Madagascar and far away. Historically, the Chagos Islands have nothing to do, strictly nothing to do with Mauritius, because until the late 18th century, no one lived on the Chagos Islands, and it was the French who brought slaves from Africa to develop their plantation. And what was unfortunate for the British was that the British government inherited those islands from the French because of the Napoleon War. So after Napoleon was defeated, or many French possessions became part of the British Empire, and Mauritius and the Chagos Islands were some of those, French possessions inherited by the British. So for that very incidental historical reason, Mauritius and the Chagos Islands were governed, administered together by the British government based in Mauritius. But the problem was, after there was the Cuba crisis in 1962, the Americans wanted to construct a new base in the Indian Ocean, and the British government agreed with the American government, US government, to build a new base in the Indian Ocean. And then they decided to do so on the Chagos Islands. So when Mauritius was given independence in 1965, the British government separated the Chagos Islands from Mauritius to make sure that Mauritius does not have sovereignty over the Chagos Islands. Then the Mauritius government agreed to that deal, then so that the Chagos Islands could be safely loaned to the Americans. That was the deal made in 1965, which turned out to be quite tragic. Because after they made that deal, the Americans wanted to get those islanders out of the islands, the descendants of the plantation slaves, and then they were forcibly ousted from the island in a quite a miserable way. And then British government gave, then most of them went to Mauritius, and the British government gave money to the Mauritius government to take care of those ex-islanders, former islanders, but the Mauritius government was in such a chaos, so the Mauritius government didn't give money to those former islanders for many years. For 4 or 5 years. It took 4 or 5 years for the Mauritius government to do anything for the former islanders. So after such difficulties and turmoils, the islanders suffered so much, and they got so angry about the British government, and now the British government is in political trouble. So what happened last year is that, so the case was brought before the International Court of Justice, and the International Court of Justice somehow accepted the case and rendered a judgment on that case. And then in the judgment, the International Court of Justice declared that the British government should cease its illegal occupation of the island, or not precisely, undue occupation of the islands immediately without delay, and then so the British government was ordered to leave the island. But today, that was in February last year, but 1 year after that kind of judgment, the British government is still there. Actually, it is not the British government, it is the US Army, US Navy is still there, and the British government is still keeping its contractual obligation to the US government. So the British government is now in a very bad shape in international relations. So according to the British government, statement by the UK, so that statement made before the International Court of Justice, Mauritius cannot get around the basic fact. This is a basic fact according to the British. that its elected representatives agreed in 1965 to the detachment of the Chagos archipelago in the years leading up to the independence in 1965. And likewise, that Mauritius subsequently reaffirmed its consent post-independence. So in 1962 and the time leading to its independence in 1965, Mauritius agreed to, be separated from the Chagos Islands. Because historically, the Chagos Islands had nothing to do with Mauritius, before the European colonization. So let's get back to the situation before the European colonization. So Mauritius can be, happy with Mauritius, and the Chagos Islands should be returned to the Europeans who have colonized it. So that was the idea. But that's the British statement. And the statement by Mauritius, the so-called consent which was given was extracted in circumstances of duress. There was coercion. There's, unforgivable coercion exercised by the British over the people of Mauritius. And on condition that vitiated any notion that it was freely given. It was not a consent in the true sense of the term. It was a forced consent. But perhaps the Mauritius Prime Minister did sign the contract, a sort of contract, did give his signature to the paper, but that was forced, and there was no freely given consent to it. By the way, the Cyprus government, the government of Cyprus was very happy to join the procedure and made a statement, a very strong statement. Any such excision of territory prior to or at the time of independence is inherently suspicious and in any case is not permissible without the free and continuing consent of those entitled to exercise the right of self-determination. The Cyprus theory is very strong. According to Cyprus, to make the Chagos deal, valid, it's not necessary to get the agreement of the disputing parties. So for the Chagos Islands, about the Chagos Islands case, the Mauritius government at first asked the British government to agree to the contentious procedure to get a legally binding judgment. But the British government, of course, refused. Then the Mauritius government went to the General Assembly of the United Nations and asked the General Assembly of the United Nations to make a request for an advisory opinion. And that's the reason why, even though the British government refused to have this case before the International Court of Justice, an advisory opinion was rendered on this case. But from the viewpoint of a traditional international law, this is exactly an abuse of power by the International Court of Justice. The International Court of Justice has the power to give advisory opinions on non-contested, on non-disputed cases. It is just the power to give an advisory opinion. So what should be done for the climate change, for other things for which there are no direct disputing parties. When there are disputing parties should agree on the jurisdiction of the court, and there should be a legally binding judgment. The advisory procedure should not be abused in this way to circumvent, to go around the basic procedure before the International Court of Justice. So the principle of consent-based jurisdiction was ignored with the Chagos Islands case. Of course, there were some, detailed technical legalistic arguments about to justify it, but to the traditional viewpoint of international law, this case was surprising. First, the International Court of Justice accepted the case and rendered a quasi-judgment on it under the name of advisory opinion. And also it was surprising that even though international legal title is usually based on the acquiescence, consent of the potential contenders, but the requirement for valid acquiescence seems changing. That is to say that the Mauritius agreed to the separation of the Chagos Island from it in 1965, and that agreement is valid 60 years later, 70 years later, should be. But the International Court of Justice reinterpreted what was seemed to be a consent in 1965, 1962, 1965, and decided in favor of Mauritius. That was surprising. And finally, just last slide. So all this, what lessons to be drawn from all this of the British experience? So about the Senkak Diaoyu Tai case. The Senkak Diaoyu case is a relatively simple case. From the traditional viewpoint of it, from the viewpoint of traditional international law, there is no chance for the Chinese government to claim sovereignty there, because the Senkak Islands were occupied by the Japanese in 1895, and the Chinese government did not make any protest against the Japanese occupation of the islands until 1970. So for 75 years, the Chinese government was silent. So in 1895, it was Qin Dynasty, and later in 1911 there was a Republic of China established after the revolution, and in 1949 there was another revolution to establish the People's Republic of China, and none of these successive governments protested against the Japanese occupation of the Senkak Islands until 1970. So from the traditional way of thinking of international law, the Japanese sovereignty is very well established. But if you apply the logic of the Chagos Islands case, well, in 1895, China was in trouble. Japan was in the way of imperial expansion. And the China did not make any protest, but China was silenced by the Japanese force. And so tacit acquiescence, the tacit implicit consent of the Chinese government to the Japanese occupation of those islands its validity is quite suspicious. I mean, if you apply the way of thinking in the Chagos Islands case. And on top of that, I have said 1895. In 1895, China was at war with Japan. So Japan started its occupation of the Diaoyu Islands when Japan was overwhelming by force the Chinese forces. So according to the Japanese, those islands were occupied peacefully during the war. Excuse me, that's a very suspicious statement. And if we bring this case to the International Court of Justice, well, I think the Japanese government will be in trouble. Then let's think about the Dr. Takeshima case. So Dr. Takeshima case, well, Dr. Takeshima case, even from the viewpoint of traditional international law, the Japanese position is not that strong because the Japanese government started to occupy the Takeshima Islands in 1905. And then Korea came under Japanese sovereignty in 1910. So from 1910 until 1945, for 35 years, the Korean Peninsula was under Japanese control. But according to the Japanese government, using the Japanese logic, in 1905, Korea was still independent. And Japan occupied the Takeshima Islands, declared its occupation of the Takeshima Islands. And the Korean government did not make any protest. So, well, there was a blank of 35 years from 1910 to 1945, but the Korean tacit consent, well, Korean acquiescence to Japanese acquisition of the Takeshima Islands is still valid. So the Takeshima Islands was validly acquired by the Japanese government in 1905. So that is the Japanese logic. But this logic will look very dubious if you bring it before the International Court of Justice. Well, in 1905, Korea was technically independent. But in 1905, what was going on? In 1905, Japan was at war with Russia over the control of the Korean Peninsula. And it was after the Japanese Navy started to overwhelm the Russian Navy, the Japanese government occupied the Takeshima Islands. So, and the Korean government, as of 1905, was already under the de facto control of the Japanese government. And even if the Korean government did not make any explicit protest against the Japanese government, that cannot be considered as valid acquiescence, valid consent to the Japanese occupation of the islands. And then now we have the new way to use advisory proceedings before the International Court of Justice established by the Chagos Islands case. Even if your opponent does not agree to the jurisdiction of the International Court of Justice, you can use the advisory opinion procedure. Then, well, for the moment, the Korean government and the Chinese government, neither of them are very much willing to show up before the International Court of Justice. But if I were a legal advisor for the Republic of Korea, I would strongly advise them to bring the case before the International Court of Justice. Soon after the Chagos Islands case, this is the time to bring the case before the International Court of Justice, and we have a very good chance. Well, by the way, anyway, winning a dispute, legally winning a dispute, is not always the best solution. Perhaps for the Chinese government, it would be a good gesture to give up the claim to the Diaoyu Islands so that it can show to the world that China is a peace-loving country, for example. Or the other way around, the Japanese government can just give up its claim to the Dr. Takeshima Islands so that it can show to the world that Japan is a peace-loving country. And again, there is a very bad example, shown by the British government. the British government was, well, it was not a legal fight, but an actually military conflict. The British government was victorious in 1982 in the Falkland Islands case. But that makes the British position still very difficult in relation to Argentina and other countries. And what people now know that the British government was about to return the Falkland Islands, I mean, give up the Falkland Islands in favor of Argentina. The negotiation was going on until 1981, but because of the war which broke out, but it was Argentina who started it. But unfortunately, because of the war, now the situations of the Falkland Islands are now in a kind of legal limbo. So the Japanese government, there again, should learn from the British experience. So I'm sorry, it's not really conclusive. So I just wanted to share my, passion for territorial disputes. And then I think this is this topic is about the first slide. In the first slide, I said this topic is very important. In the same time, it is very interesting how the governments come in conflict for very meaningless things. That's the way we can really enjoy learning the international relations and how we can enjoy learning about international law. I'm sorry that it was not very well organized. I think that it is about the time to stop here, and I'd like to hear your views or questions and comments and anything. So shall I?
That's fine.
Okay. Okay.